Welcome, everyone, to tonight's virtual curator talk, Civil Rights and Photography. My name is Ashley Kausinger. I'm a Learning Lab specialist here at the Gwinnett County Public Library, who's tonight's host. And I'm excited to introduce tonight's speaker, Sarah Kennel. Sarah Kennel is a High Museum of Art's curator of photography. She joined the High in July of 2019. Previously, Sarah was a curator at the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem, Massachusetts, where she oversaw an extensive collection of photographs dating from 1839 to present and managed an active photography program there. She also co-curated the critically acclaimed touring exhibition, Sally Mann, 1,000 Crossings, organized by Peabody Essex and the National Gallery of Art, which also toured to the High and opened in October of 2019. As an art historian, Kennel has written and contributed to many publications, including the catalog for Sally Mann, 1,000 Crossings. She also taught at Princeton University, the University of California, Berkeley, and George Washington University. And her numerous fellowships and awards include the Samuel H. Crest Postdoctoral Curatorial Fellowship and the Mary Davis Pre-Doctoral Fellowship at the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts, both at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. She earned her doctorate and a master's of art and art history from the University of California, Berkeley, and bachelor's of arts from Princeton University. Sarah, thank you so much for joining us tonight. And now over to you.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Ashley, and thank you for inviting me to speak tonight. And hello, friends. I'm really happy to be speaking with you tonight about an amazing exhibition that's up on view at the High, as well as give you a brief overview of our civil rights photography collection. I'm going to share my screen so you have something more exciting to look at than me. Let's hope we get it going. Working. Okay, slideshow. I've gotten much better at this since last March. All right. Here we go. Whoops, there we go. So just first introduce myself. I'm the Keogh family curator of photography at the High Museum of Art. And that means essentially that the really generous Keogh family has given money to the High Museum to endow a position as a curator. And I thought, since some people don't know what curators do, sometimes I don't even know what curators do, I would just explain a little bit about the most exciting aspects of my job, which is, along with an amazing team of photography curators and curatorial assistants, I steward our collection of photographs at the High Museum of Art. We have more than 8,500 photographs. And what that means is that I take care of them. We make sure that they're properly cataloged and stored. We study them. We put together exhibitions from our collection. We also take exhibitions from other museums around the country, and we work with other museums to do new scholarship. We bring more work into the collection as well because we want to keep sort of growing our holdings of photographs. And then we also like to give talks and meet other artists and photographers and anybody who loves photography. So the best parts of my job really are working with art itself and working with people who love art. So that's kind of in a nutshell what we do. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about one of our most distinguished aspects of the photography collection at the High Museum of Art, one that was built by and I'm really learning about it myself along with all of you. And then I'll give you a kind of virtual tour of an exhibition that's up right now called Dawoud Bey, an American Project. And hopefully the museum is open. I'll give you some information at the end of this talk about our hours and when you can go and how much it costs, when there are free days. But if you're not out and about these days, which I totally understand, hopefully you'll at least have gotten a good taste of the show this way. So now the High Museum of Art started collecting civil rights photography about 20 years ago. And of course, it makes a lot of sense in Atlanta, with MLK and the city's strong commitment and presence of civil rights leaders and activists in this country. But I would say that at the time that the museum started collecting civil rights photography, a lot of people really didn't consider it fine art. And in fact, we have sort of about close to 400 civil rights photographs in the collection. covering the period of, I would say, of the historic civil rights, what we think of as the period in the United States between 1955 and 68. But as you'll see, we've expanded beyond that. And there are something like 42 identified makers of those pictures, but of course we that got into the stream of the press, and we're not entirely sure. So it's kind of an exciting collection that still we do a lot of research on. And again, as I had mentioned in the beginning, a lot of museums at the time didn't really collect civil rights photography. It was something we think of as maybe the Atlanta History Center collected. But my predecessors, curators and the directors who came before me, really felt that this was an important thing for the High Museum to have, and that these photographs, these images, really are such an important part of our history, not only our American history, but also our photographic history. They're really these images that have kind of burned into our collective consciousness and really played an active role, not just in documenting civil rights in this country, but actually in participating in the movement, because many times the photographers making these pictures were doing so intentionally to show the world and show the rest of the country what was happening. So they had a really, really big impact. We're continuing to build the civil rights collection. My particular focus is expanding it. There are a lot of amazing photographers in the collection, both African-American, white photographers, women, but we'd like to see a broader representation, particularly of women photographers, African-American photographers, but also to think about civil rights beyond the historic struggle for desegregation, voting rights, and equality for African Americans, to think also about LGBTQ rights, to think about the Poor People's Campaign. So hopefully in future years, you'll be seeing some of that. So I can't possibly give you a kind of whole history of the movement, but one thing or even of our collection, but I can just give you the broad parameters. So we have works really from the earliest kind of period of the civil rights in the 1950s. And as I said, sometimes we don't know who makes the photographer. The work on the left, though, is really well known, and it shows the 15-year-old Elizabeth Eckford walking completely alone to the Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. This was the moment of sort of desegregation of this high school. The reason why she's alone actually is that she had not gotten the notification that desegregation was going to be postponed by a day. So the next day, the other students, I think there were 9 students in total who had chosen to integrate this high school. But you see her completely brave, just walking through this crowd of, truly sort of hate spewing people. And so you think about the courage that she is evincing there. You'll also notice that this is not a pristine photograph. If you look up at the upper corners, you see kind of stains on it. One of the amazing things about a lot of these photographs, and I'll show you later, is you see the life they've lived. Sometimes you see press stamps on the back, you see the captions that they were published with. So we realize that these are not just images that were taken and went to a museum, but they circulated around the world. The work that is on the right side of the screen is by Ernest Withers, who's one of the key Black photographers of the civil rights movement. And what we see is the first desegregated bus ride in Montgomery, Alabama, 1956. And he was a self-employed photographer working in Memphis and really documented, many of the movements of the civil rights, including the sanitation workers strike in Memphis. And he also produced a book on Emmett Till. In addition to kind of covering these really important moments, we also have many of the key figures in the civil rights movement. We have portraits of them, photographs of them at various protests or giving speeches. And because this is an Atlanta-based collection, we have a very strong representation of Martin Luther King and his circle, as well as, the picture on the right, we see Andrew Young, MLK, and John Lewis. So kind of our hometown heroes, in 1963. And then, of course, the famous Selma March of 1965. But the collection is not just sort of famous events and famous people. The scope and the goal of the collection is really to show the experiences of all kinds of people. I will say that some of the images are violent and traumatic. I just want to let you know that there are some works in there that we think sensitively about how we show these, but I think it's important that the historical record is preserved, and we see the firemen blasting demonstrators in Alabama with their hoses. But also on the right is a really fascinating kind of document, because it reminds us that many of the photographers who were making these pictures were themselves at risk, but the ones who were at greatest risk were the photographers of color. So what you see on the right is a photograph by Danny Lyon, who was a key figure in the civil rights movement. He was a member of the SNCC, of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, but he also was a white photographer who had access to take a lot of these pictures in a way that Black photographers often didn't have. And what you're seeing there, the figure in the middle, is another photographer of color, Clifford Vaz, who knew he was going to be arrested and essentially gave Danny Lyon his flash, saying he didn't need it because he was going to be arrested and he wanted Danny to take those pictures. So we actually see the real engagement and the risk, the bodily risk that many photographers place themselves in, but also the commitment that they had, the importance that they knew, because these photographs really galvanized public sentiment in the United States in many places, who really did not understand the kind of horrors of racism and segregation in the South. We also have a really wonderful selection of photographs that document sort of the commitment of everyday people and young people to the civil rights movement. And here I have two of my favorite pictures are both of young people who were on the famous Selma to Montgomery March in 1965, which ultimately resulted in the passage of the Voting Rights Act. So we see Bobby Simmons, with a sort of famous vote across his face. And of course, that has a lot of resonance even today, now in 2020, 2021 in Georgia, the importance of voting. And on the right, the 20-year-old Doris Wilson, who was a lunchroom monitor and was actually fired from her job for participating in civil rights demonstrations. And you can see also she's got the homemade sign, I have overcome. So really capturing the kind of experiences of everyday individuals, as well as the famous people who led the civil rights movement, is part of our goal. I mentioned that we don't always know the makers of the work, but sometimes the works themselves are so powerful. They're such an important part of the record that we chose to bring this in. And the work on the left is incredibly heartbreaking. It also relates in a way to what we'll be seeing later with the work of Dawoud Bey. But it's a portrait of a couple, Mr. and Mrs. Mcneil, and it's their daughter who was killed in the 1963 church bombing in Birmingham. And he, in fact, the gentleman, he was a studio photographer himself. So here we have, a photograph of a family, but their daughter can only be represented by a photograph, and he is a photographer as well. So there's this kind of amazing sense of the importance of photography and documenting and honoring and witnessing. But you also see as well the typed caption that often accompanied press images. Sometimes the captions were written by the photographers and sometimes not. And sometimes the same photograph could appear with different captions as it circulated in different news organizations. The picture on the right is by Dr. Doris Derby, who was an important civil rights worker and became an important sort of doctor and anthropologist. And she really focused on the role of women in the civil rights. And so not so much, the absolute front lines demonstrations, but more, the women working in these health clinics or getting the vote out. And so, her work is as a Black woman documenting the civil rights was, and the role of women in civil rights is one that we cherish. And I think we have a few more. Again, in terms of thinking more broadly about how do we represent the experience of Black Americans during a period of segregation and in the South, we turn to the work of the great Gordon Parks. This was a series of work acquired in 2012 in conjunction with the Gordon Parks Foundation. He was really one of the most important Black photographers in America, really one of the most important photographers working in America, and created a body of work known as Segregation Story, in which he's really showing the psychological and emotional impacts of segregation on Black Americans, but also, the beauty and the dignity of lives. And I think it's that combination that really makes these works so incredibly alluring. Also, he was really working in color here. He did a lot of work for major magazines, including Life magazine. And I think, to see this moment in full color is incredibly alluring. And the last photograph I wanted to sort of tell you about is represents our ongoing commitment to civil rights photography and also the ongoing need for civil rights demonstrations, which is a sad but important fact of contemporary America, that the 1960s and now there's a lot of parallels, and a photographer who's recognized this and made this part of the body of work that she's doing on an ongoing basis is Atlanta's own Sheila Pre-Bright. She started photographing civil rights, or really Black Lives Matter demonstrations, in 2015, and was struck by the parallels and the historical resonance between, this current moment, 2015, all the way up, through this past summer, Black Lives Matter demonstrations, and the 1960s. And so this is one of her photographs from this ongoing project, hashtag 1960 to now, historic civil rights photography, but also looking at this present moment. And I love how she focuses so much too on these children and really on the youth and how determined they are, but also kind of how sad it is that, this is the experience that they have. Just on a side note, we have an ongoing commissioning initiative at the High Museum of Art called Picturing the South. And Sheila's work will be part of that coming up soon. So we'll get to see more of her work. Let's see. So now I wanted to give you a kind of overview or virtual tour of the exhibition that's up right now, Dawoud Bey, An American Project. And I know this is kind of a quick segue, but I think as we go through the photographs, you'll see the connections between Dawoud's work and the civil rights photography, not in the least because the artist himself, this was the atmosphere in which he grew up. He was born in 1953, grew up in Queens. His parents were active members of civil rights organizations. They went to go see, James Baldwin speak. Very early on, he was immersed in this movement. So that is part of his formation as a photographer. He's one of the most important photographers working today. And he is the subject of this retrospective that's currently up at the High. I do want to acknowledge that the show was organized and curated by my colleagues at SF MoMA and the Whitney Museum of Art. So this was a chance for me to take a show that another institution has organized and put it up at the High. But one of the really nice things is that the High Museum has a very extensive collection of Bey's work. We have more than 55 pieces. So we got to shape the show and put in a lot of our own pieces in a couple of the sections. So we're really glad that we're able to kind of participate in a meaningful way. So here are some facts about Bey. That, he's received incredible honors. He's a MacArthur Fellow and a Guggenheim Fellow and an NEA grant. But I think that, what's so interesting is looking at all of his work really back from his origins. And, he talks about being really interested in photography from one visit to a museum, which happened when he was a teenager. That one, which was in 1969. He grew up in Queens, and he heard about this show that was very controversial. It was at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, called Harlem on My Mind, as you see the catalog on the left. Now, why was this controversial? Well, the Met had really not taken on a subject like Harlem and Black life in America before. They also really didn't involve any Black curators or speak with Black community members. And much of the exhibition consisted of photo murals and not actual works of art. And most of the artists in the show were white. So many reasons why the Black community reacted with a lot of concern about this show. Bey tells a story about when he was a teenager. He wanted to go down and see what all the protests were about. There had been picket lines outside the Met. And he goes to the Met, and the day that he arrives, there's no protests outside. So he decides to wander in. And, he describes it as being, sort of a teenager from Queens, never having walked into the museum before. But, going up, and the Met, was pay what you wish, sort of going in and finding his way around. But once he finally got to this show, he talked about the experience of seeing the work, particularly the photographs of James Van Der Zee. He was one of the most important photographers of Harlem in the 1920s and 30s. And I think you can see here that, Van Der Zee captures just the glamour and the beauty of, Harlem when it was the epicenter of Black life and Black intelligentsia and, fashion and culture and music. And Bey talked about the experience of seeing Black Americans on the walls of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And for him, that really clicked. And it kind of laid the foundations for what he wanted to do with his life, which was to become a photographer, but also to change the politics around representation, to expand museums and other similar spaces so that this would not be a unique experience, so that people could walk into a museum, whoever you were, and see yourself represented on the walls of the museum. So that really is a kind of something that has continued throughout his career. So he begins to study photography, mostly self-taught in the beginning, and he starts taking pictures in Harlem. Now, why Harlem? He grew up in Queens, but a couple of reasons. First, there was this connection with Van Der Zee, but also he had his family connections with Harlem. And I love these snapshots of his mother and his aunt and their gorgeous furs and their hats, and just the way that they're posing for the camera. And it's also where his parents met. So there's a family connection to Harlem. And as he's learning to photograph, he's also looking at the work of a lot of other photographers. Probably the most important one is Roy de Carava, a photographer based in New York, who is, I think, maybe among the top most talented photographers of the 20th century. Incredible work. And also a key figure for Black artists at the time. On the left, you see his collaboration with Langston Hughes' photo book, The Sweet Flypaper of Life, which has just been reissued recently, so you can find a modern copy if you can't find an old copy. But the other thing about de Carava's work, is he's really thinking about representing his community, with a very complex lens of the interiority and psychological complexity of being Black. And he was reacting to a lot of documentary photography, especially by white photographers, that looked kind of at neighborhoods like Harlem, sort of from the outside, through a sociological lens. And I think that the complexity and the psychological sort of richness of Carava's work really appealed to Bey. The other thing, as you can see, is that Carava really is an amazing printer, and he's using the actual color black in very important ways. And this will come back. I'll signal it later on in the talk, where Dawoud Bey returns again and again to the graphic qualities of Carava's work, the way that he prints in very dark tones, and he makes blacks and dark grays in his pictures very expressive. But he's also looking at a wide range of photographers. Irving Penn, who did a series called The Small Trades, where he's really photographing simple, everyday people, but dressed in their clothes of their profession, very straightforward. He looked at a photographer who ran a photo studio in Heber Springs, Arkansas, and it sort of became famous. This is not a fine art photographer, it was a commercial photographer at the time. Has kind of entered into the world of fine art now. And he was looking even at people like Richard Avedon. And Bey talks about, being a young man and kind of wandering into these New York photography galleries, and people really not acknowledging him or looking up at him at all or talking to him, but that he was there to look at the art and learn from the artists. So when he starts making his first important body of work, he goes to Harlem. And this is really the picture he talks about as being kind of his first successful picture. And it's a really powerful picture of this gentleman that he encountered. And he sort of encountered him a couple times and realized at that moment that he had to figure out how to have a relationship with his subjects. Like, he knew he wanted to photograph him, but this man was speaking with a bunch of other people. He wanted to photograph him alone. So he realized early on that, if you're going to make pictures of people, you're going to develop a relationship with them. So he had to kind of screw up the courage to ask this gentleman if he'd pose for him. And then the gentleman said, "Sure, what do you want me to do?" And then Bey was like, "Well, I don't know." And then that gesture you just did. So this is a picture where he's really figuring out not just the mechanics of photography, which he already knew, but maybe we can call it the dialogue between photographer and subject. What I also love about this picture, though, this is done in the 1970s, but this guy could be, with his bowler hat and his tie, he could be coming out of the Harlem of the 20s and the 30s, with his sense of elegance and pride. And a lot of the pictures that Bey makes early on in Harlem, I think, are his homage to that older generation, the generation that grew up in the 20s and the 30s. These ladies with their incredible hats and their jewelry, but there's also, of course, here that police line. Now, these are three women at a parade, but it adds a little sense of tension to the picture, right? He makes a lot of photographs of people in their professional spaces, and this is one of my favorite ones. This is D.S. Mcneil, the barber, and of course, the barber shop is such a central kind of place for community gathering. But he's standing there with pride. He's got all of his products on his counter. He's got his foot on the stool. But the background, he's actually created himself. He's sort of sprayed, painted, and painted the background so that his artistry is apparent in his environment. And that's what we see in Dawoud's picture, is a kind of recognition of the person who is standing in front of the lens, their whole life coming towards it. So I think that that's what is so wonderful about these pictures. Now, he made a lot of pictures of the older generation, but he also focused a lot on kids as well. And not every picture is necessarily a portrait where the subject is looking at the photographer. He's also studying kind of street photography. He's looking at photographers like Gary Winogrand and Lee Freelander, sort of capturing these moments on the street. And I love these four kids because they're all in sort of different movements, almost like one person, enacting different movements. We have this sort of sense of kind of circular shape, but also even just how nicely they're dressed, and they're waiting for the bus and they're pulling out their bus passes. So I think he's really capturing the kind of quality of everyday life and the sort of youthful exuberance. Or here, one of the most famous pictures from this moment, he talked about spotting this young kid who he had the glasses on, he had the tracksuit jacket, he was totally styling. And what I love about the way that Dawoud captures him is, you look at him in the top half that's leaning on this, kind of a wooden structure, is relaxed and it's cool. But if you look down, you see how hard he's trying with his feet to kind of stand tall, and that captures that little awkwardness, that kind of sense of, he's trying to be a teenager, but he's also a young boy. And so, capturing this moment really wonderfully. So Dawoud makes these photographs in the 1970s, and the first place he shows them is in the Studio Museum of Harlem. And this is, some of you may have been, it's now in a completely different structure, but I just loved kind of showing where it is. You see on the right, that little sign, Studio Museum. And this was in part because this was Dawoud's community. It was a really vibrant artistic community, but also because he felt it was really important to show the pictures where they were made. And so the people who lived in that community could see them. So that was really kind of critical thing for him, and continues to be. After that first section, and that's the first section of the exhibition, we have a section where we're really looking at Dawoud's kind of evolution as a photographer. And he goes through this period in the 1980s where he's experimenting with using what he calls a small camera, a fast camera, 35 millimeter. And this lightweight nature of these cameras and the speed make them really amenable to taking kind of street photography and capturing people unawares. But what I really love about the way that Dawoud uses the camera in a lot of these is, he's encountering strangers, but he's still making photographs that kind of establish a relationship. This picture in particular is a young woman waiting for the bus. And I think if you notice, you've got this really amazing vertical line, and she's half in shadow and half in bright sunlight, which is a device that, his kind of Roy de Carava would do. But I also love there's another doubling too, because there's a woman outside in the window, and it's almost like it's her reflection. It's not, but it's like this whole picture is so carefully constructed. But we don't notice that at first. We just know somehow that it works. And then there's the sign, no loitering, which also has this kind of connotations of, official surveillance and policing people on the street. But there she is, taking a break, maybe having a cigarette or not. So there's also this little layer of, how do people navigate their environment, particularly if an environment is hostile to them. Let's see what we have next. And this is a great picture. Again, sort of caught on the fly, but we have such a great acknowledgement between the main subject, well, one of the main subjects, this woman doing possibly her daughter's hair, sort of peeking around the corner and looking, smiling so broadly at photographer. You see how formally it works. You've got the shaft of light coming in one way, and then her elbow is the other way, so it forms this X. But then you also have, this moment of sort of tension too. There's a little girl, and she looks like she's in tears. Like she does not want to be there. It hurts. She doesn't want to get her hair done. Maybe she wants to go play with her friends. So, have this whole kind of other emotional story and ritual. And of course the ritual of having your hair done, and not wanting to get it done, or, having to have it brushed out. So there's so many different layers to this picture. And yet it seems like he just caught it on the instant. Or even here we have two boys, who are on a court, on a handball court, but instead of capturing them in a moment of action, he's caught them kind of at repose. And even here we have that great direct gaze between the young boy at front and the photographer. So he makes these photographs in the 1980s, many of them in Syracuse, New York, because he's there, sort of has a residency at a place called Lightwork. And that's where he decided to photograph on the Black community, to photograph in the Black community in Syracuse. But at a certain point, he becomes a little disenchanted with this way of making photographs. He still felt that, you know, it was a quick interaction, and that as a photographer with a camera on the street, you have a kind of power over people, right? You can capture them unawares. And that's a lot of times that's sort of the thrill of looking at the street photographs. But there's something also potentially predatory about that, right? You know, the person with the camera is deciding to take the picture. The person in the picture often isn't necessarily aware. And Bay is, you know, very conscious too of the ways in which, you know, people of color in particular have been at the other end of the power dynamic in photography. So he starts to really think about working differently, and he starts making these photographs with a kind of film called Type 55 film. It's made with Polaroid. And to make these photographs, he had to use a tripod. He's using a bigger camera. So he really had to set it up. He had to ask people to pose for him. But the other thing about this film is, you know, it's a Polaroid, so it produces an instant print, which you peel apart, and you have a print, which you would give to the sitter, but you also have a negative, which is kind of an unusual thing. I grew up with the Polaroids that just spit out the print, but there was no negative. So he could give the print to the sitter as a kind of exchange, and he could take the negative and make prints from it, which is what he's done. And for this exhibition, he's taken those prints and he's blown them up beyond life size. So he's printed them very large, something he couldn't do at the time in the 1990s. He just didn't have the technology. And so what I love about this is that it really monumentalizes these figures. The active exchange happened at the moment of making the photograph. And I think it also changes the way that his sitters look at basically us as we're looking at these. This is one of my favorite pictures because it's such a affirmative and proud picture of young love, and, you know, everything about her pose with her kind of chin up, looking a little bit regal and imperious. You know, she's kind of holding him, you know, a little bit protectively. He's looking down, you know, they're kind of balancing the way they're looking. They're holding each other so closely. There's something so appealing about their connection. But also it's the kind of affirmative picture of young Black love and Black life that, you know, Bey hadn't seen a lot of growing up, which had not been part of the mainstream photography or art world. So, you know, his doing this and his decision also to make these very large is, you know, is a ethical one, a political one, as well as an artistic one. And again, here too, just his ability to kind of capture the personality of people. I mean, this woman, she's wearing a hat and sunglasses. You know, we can't really necessarily see her face, and yet we get such a strong sense of who she is through her body language and through kind of Bey allowing her to present herself to the camera. Um, or and again, he just has a wonderful sense for young people. But when I spent some time looking at this picture of the boy eating the Foxy Pop, and I know some of you may be old enough to remember this, you know, get them from the ice cream trucks. But this picture works for so many reasons. You know, it's just, and Bey was very careful about where he placed his subjects, you know. But one of the reasons why it works is that, you know, you have this long ruler-like form of the Foxy Pop, which has got kind of, you know, letters on it, but it's vertical. And then we have the same kind of form, but horizontal in the background. And it's the same thing. It's lines with lettering on it and lines with lettering on it. And so it's these formal decisions that he's making as a photographer that work to kind of support the image. We're not necessarily aware of them when we look at it. You know, I'm mostly aware of this boy's eyes and his gaze and his youth, and maybe it's summertime and he's got a bathing suit on. But if we begin to think about also the construction of the picture, we realize, you know, what a kind of thoughtful photographer Bey is, and how he really adapts his materials and his compositions to whatever subject he's trying to express. And in fact, you know, he really did change the way he photographed has done it throughout his career, according to whatever subject he was working on. This is one of the last pictures in this section where he's using this Type 55, and you might notice it's a little different. We're really up close now. In fact, part of her head is cut off, this girl, but we can really see all the detail in her face. The other thing you might notice in some of these is the edges of the pictures look like they have kind of dark swirls on them. That's actually when you take the negative and the print in this kind of film and you peel it apart, you see on the edges of the negative and on the print, this kind of where the film peeled apart. So you also get the sense of kind of how these are made. So during this period, he's making these photographs. He's using this type of Polaroid film, and he becomes more interested in Polaroid. And so that leads really to the next body of work, which is one of my favorites, in which he's using a large scale camera. It's called the Polaroid 20 by 24 camera. And it's called that because each picture that it spits out of its machine is 20 inches by 24 inches. The camera itself weighs 235 pounds. It's about 6 feet tall. It's not something you take out on the street. You do studio work with it. But during this period in the 1990s, the Polaroid Corporation really wanted artists to experiment with their products. And so they had a couple of these cameras and they invited artists like Bey to work with it. So he made a series of photographs, but he didn't just make single ones of people. He started to think about, what does it mean to take a picture of somebody? Can we really capture the complexity of an individual in one picture? And of course, the answer is no. So he started making these multi-frame portraits and kind of putting them together in different shapes and grids. And I think that one of the things that I also really find striking about these pictures, and you'll see it in here and in here, is his choice of background. He's using this kind of dark brown background. And there's a couple things about this that are striking. One is that, here, I think you can see too, how beautifully it harmonizes with her skin tones. And there's a whole history about kind of racism and the development of color photography, which decided that normative skin tone was lighter skin tones. And film didn't always capture the beauty of various shades of skin tones. And so Bey is aware of that. So he's choosing a color and a background that really enhances the beauty of his subjects and their skin colors. But he's also channeling a whole history of painting, and especially Rembrandt. And he talks about how when he was in the 6th grade, he had to do a report on Rembrandt. So he learned about, I'm going to get back, he learned about Rembrandt's techniques, in particular about the use of these dark backgrounds and the kind of shadowing, and the way that they kind of imparted a sense of inner psychology to the sitters. So he's also looking at that whole history of painting and thinking about his subjects as being, as important and as noble and as interesting and complex as Rembrandt's subjects. So that's what's sort of wonderful about these. And sometimes we don't even see the faces straight on. We see these kind of beautiful details of the hair or the nails or the skin, and also the importance of grooming and self-care and self-presentation really comes out in these. He's particularly interested in how young people style themselves too. So this series of photographs, particularly is interested in young people, kind of leads to the next one, which is called class pictures. And, one thing about Bey that I haven't really mentioned is, in addition to making all of this art, he's been a teacher. He's been a professor of photography, and he loves working with students. And he continues to teach at the Columbia College in Chicago. But he's also done a lot of residencies where he works with young people. And this series of class pictures started in a residency where he began to make photographs of young people, kind of collaborate with them, but also include their own, and you just see him in one of the classes, their own narratives. And he's juxtaposing the picture he makes of them with the way that they represent themselves. And, you get this wonderful snapshot of sort of, how, at this moment of kind of identity formation as a teenager. These young people think about themselves. Bey is really conscious that, the stereotypes of teenagers in the media are, pretty negative, that either they're troublemakers or they're kind of consumers. And so he's trying to show their inner complexity, but also let them speak. So this is part of his idea of photography as a collaborative act. But the other thing about class pictures too, the title itself is kind of a play, right? It's like the idea of the school picture, the class picture. But there's also a sense as well of social class. He made these, some of them in very kind of wealthy private schools, boarding schools, but he was very conscious to also make photographs in nearby communities in some of the public schools, which were less economically advantaged. And so it's also, as a viewer, you're not really sure who was who, but you sort of can pick up on his sense as well of how social forces may shape an individual, but also how they construct themselves in relationship to their environment and in relationship to those expectations. And it's probably can't read all of Kevin's narratives, but he's just one of the most, kind of powerful sitters that Bey has photographed, the way that he is kind of shaping his own representation, including his Superman hat, which he has done himself, which says Kevin on it in Superman letters. So it's a great series, and it really, I think, changes the way we think a lot about teenagers. Remind me when I have a teenager that they're actually lovely people. So I mentioned in the beginning the kind of importance of civil rights to Dawoud Bey, that this was the atmosphere, that he grew up in, this moment. His parents were very engaged, as he was, in the civil rights movement. He started working on this project, which is called the Birmingham Portfolio, well before 2012, which is the date he made these pictures, because he had been long affected by the 1963 church bombing in Birmingham that killed 4 little girls in the church, as well as 2 boys later that day in related violence, which is a fact that's a lot less well known and that I learned in the process of working on this exhibition. And in fact, here's just some photographs of the people who were big influences on him. But what you see on the right, this publication, The Movement, it was one that his parents actually kind of left around the house. And when he looked through it as a child, he found this picture, which he said had haunted him his whole life. And it's the picture of Sarah Jean Collins, the sister of Addie Mae Collins. Addie Mae was killed in the church bombing, and Sarah Jean Collins was gravely injured, as you can see. And he talks about waking up one day, bolt upright, with that picture in his mind, knowing he had to do something about Birmingham. But he didn't know what he was going to do when he started working there. And he first started making pictures of young people in the community who were the ages that the children were when they were killed. But he felt that wasn't enough to really convey what had happened, how to experience it emotionally. So then he started photographing members of the community who were the ages those children would have been in 2012 had they lived. So sort of a 12-year-old and a 62-year-old. Now, these are strangers that he's put together, he's paired in these diptychs. And it's a very simple device in one sense, but it's a very powerful way of inviting the viewer to consider and reflect on the cost of a life that has been taken away, by sort of showing the life that there could have been. And so he's paired these sitters, from Birmingham, in these diptychs, and he's photographed them in 2 places. One of them is the Bethel Baptist Church, which is a major center for civil rights kind of movements in Birmingham, and the other is the Birmingham Museum of Art, which you see here. In fact, he's photographed them in this room with these French Rococo tapestries in the background that are kind of all about aristocratic life. And one of the things that he noted about this project was that for some of the older sitters, it was the first time they'd ever gone into the Birmingham Museum of Art, which had been, back in the 1960s, had been a segregated place where Black Americans could only go in one day a week. So he not only sort of brought these individuals into the museum space, but then as a whole was first shown at the Birmingham Museum of Art. And so we see, back going back to sort of Bey's early experience with the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the importance for him of kind of amplifying and centering Black life, within institutional spaces like museums. But also the depth of his thinking here, the way of trying to show in an emotional way, not just a kind of documentary way, the cost of racial violence. And it's, really to me, one of the most powerful kind of projects he's done. He has done some forays into non-portrait work lately as well, and I'm almost done. I'm going to wrap up. And one is a series of works that he made in Harlem in 2016. It was really the first time he went back since the 1970s to photograph. And I think what you see is kind of a lament about what has happened, to Harlem, which was such an important center of kind of, Black cultural life from the 20s onward. It's now the site of, massive building and gentrification, but that gentrification means a displacement of a lot of the historically Black communities. And so in this picture where you see kind of an empty lot, and then on the left, the poster of the girls with the hairstyle, that's the only human presence in that picture. This is a little bit harder to understand at first, but what we're seeing is a kind of one of those poster storefront things that, covers up a construction site. And that's the new shiny building that's going to be built, the plans for the 3-story glass, modern H&M and all that. But you also see graffiti on it that somebody has left a mark with the word lust on it in this kind of great red paint. And it's a dialogue in this picture. It's kind of a resistance and a refusal of that process of gentrification, sort of naming, what is happening here is a kind of lust. So it's kind of a great single picture to talk about a very complex economic and social and physical transformation of this space. But I think what comes across for me in these pictures is actually the lack of visibility, the lack of people, the lack of engagement, that there is not the same life to photograph as before. And even here with the figure, he's turned away and we have this barrier and it says no entry. And I'm going to close on the most recent body of work that Dawoud Bey has done and that he's exhibited, which is a series called Night Coming Tenderly Black. And that's a line from a Langston Hughes poem. It's the last two lines are, last line is Night Coming Tenderly Black Like Me. And this is a series of work that Bey started as part of a commission for the Ohio Triennial, in which he reimagined the experience of a fugitive enslaved person making their way sort of north through the Underground Railroad. Now, there's a lot of lore about the Underground Railroad. There are a few places that are documented stops on it, but a lot of places we don't know. So this is not a historical recreation so much as an imaginative one about the kinds of places and experiences, the physical and emotional experience one might have making their way through this landscape at great risk. Now, these are photographed during the day, but they're printed very, very dark. So it looks like twilight, which is, of course, the moment when people would be under the cover, the kind of blanket of darkness, free to move through. And we are placed really within the shoes of somebody, taking this risk. And there are pictures that are foreboding. I mean, imagine traversing through this forest. But also we get to the end and we see the peaks of Lake Erie. And the very last picture, which is also the last picture of the show, I think for me sums up, so much. We've made it to the shores of Lake Erie. We know intellectually that Canada, freedom is on the other side, but there is no safe harbor necessarily. There's no ship. There's nobody else, and so it's a picture that's both sort of beautiful but also ambiguous. And to me, it's also kind of a metaphor of both how far this country has come in terms of civil rights and the struggle for equality since the time of people navigating the Underground Railroad, but also how much further we have to go, the kind of uncertainty of this moment. The last thing I want to say too, though, is that the title, Night Coming Tenderly Black, is an homage as well to Langston Hughes, to Roy de Carava, to the beauty of Black, both symbolically, but also to the color as well. And if you come to see the exhibition, I hope that you'll be as moved by these pictures as I am. Anyway, so that's my spiel. I have one more slide, which is just some information that I'm happy to answer some questions. So the museum is open. It's open Tuesdays through Saturdays, 10 to 5, Sundays at noon, so you can sleep in. There are late night hours every third Thursday for jazz, which has a separate admission fee. The second Sundays are free. We do recommend that you make reservations in advance, even if you're a member and you get in for free, just because we have space limitations due to COVID, trying to create a safe place for everybody. You can walk up and make reservations, but for the second Sundays, I would recommend reserving in advance. Children are free. It's $14.50 otherwise for general admission. And we do have a great deal now going on, a museum pass for $4 a month. And any other information is on the High's website. And the Dawoud Bey show will be up through March 14th, 17th, maybe 7th, I think 14th. So please do come see it. And now, if you have any questions, I'd really be happy to answer them. And I think maybe Ashley is going to be moderating the questions.
Yes, thank you so much, Sarah. I thought that was a really beautiful talk. I like how you tied together the civil rights collection with Dawoud Bey's show that's currently on view. And do you want to leave up the last slide of the last image while we take questions? And I just wanted to echo that I've seen this show, and these photographs are an experience to be in front of. That is different than seeing them on the screen, these ones specifically, that I would recommend seeing in person. We did get, and if you have a question that you want to add right now, we're going to take a couple. There was one that was earlier when you were talking about the civil rights collection that you did touch on a little bit, but I thought it was an excellent question. It was, does the High have plans to document the 2020 election? Too soon, historical context, ? How does a curator know when soon is too soon? Given the expansion of video and journalism, how does that also maybe impact your work?
It's such a great question, and I wish I had an answer, but it's actually a question that we've been discussing. I would say that, so first of all, there's so much. I mean, I follow on my phone so many amazing photographers that I've learned about because of recent kind of documentation of civil rights and Black Lives Matter protests. In general, the museum is a kind of conservative institution, and we're not set up necessarily to acquire like photojournalism that's being presented now. We work with galleries and artists and prints, so it's an unfamiliar working environment. I mean, let's put it this way: it took 40 years of the civil rights photographs from the 50s and 60s to kind of enter into a gallery and art context. But that's our problem. That's not the photographer's problem. So we're trying to figure out a way that we can start to do that. And maybe we have to be more creative about necessarily what we consider the proper mode of display. Would we not want to have a screen with rotating images if that's the way, in fact, most of these are being produced? I mean, there are also a lot of photographers who are making prints. So that is a real interest of ours. It seems that we need to make the current moment relevant in a historic sense by connecting it backwards, but also make our historic material living and alive and relevant by connecting it to the present. So it's an excellent question, and I hope that we have some kind of better answer soon.
That makes sense to me. I had a question. I was wondering if you can talk a little bit about when the work gets to the museum, what then is the role of the artist versus the curator, and how do you work together?
I think it depends on a lot of factors, including both the artist and the curator. Um, I think when we acquire a work, by an artist living today, we try to work with them. I mean, I just had a series of emails about, how do you want your work mounted, framed? What is the process? We try to find out as much information as possible. When we work on an exhibition, we work very closely with the artist. I mean, it's always kind of a dialogue. We have our institutional habits and limitations, but for example, even though COVID prevented Dawoud from coming out for the installation of the Dawoud Bey show, we did it virtually. So we kind of sent him plans, and then we walked through the show with our kind of FaceTime, and it was a great actually collaboration. It worked pretty well. So I prefer to have that dialogue because what we try to do is represent the artist's intentions. Now, when works come in and the artist is no longer living, and it's sort of up to us to interpret the works, it gives us a certain amount of freedom, but also more risk that we're getting it wrong. I also think that there's a value too, though, in having two perspectives, right? The artist's perspective on their own work, and then the curator's or historian's perspective on that. And so the goal, I guess, is to be able to show both.
Thank you. We just have one more question, and I think then we'll close, which is what photographers working currently are really exciting to you that you think more people should know about?
Oh my gosh. I mean, people always ask me, is it that question? Or like, who's your favorite photographer? And then you just always blank and you're like, oh, I should have said this and that and the other. But okay, so let's see. I'm just gonna make a plug for our next show, which includes a lot of photographers that you should all know about. The next show is a show of women photographers drawn primarily, although not exclusively, from the collection. And just off the top of my head, we have a wonderful little piece by Irina Rozovsky in there, which is just a little jewel and a gem, and I love it. And an interesting piece by Martine Sims, which somebody's lending to us, we don't own. And I think her work, especially also in video, is really compelling. There are some great photographers who are of an older generation and should be better known than they are. Rosalind Fox Solomon and Nancy Floyd are two names that hopefully will be in the exhibition. We are working on projects with Mcneil, who's got amazing work going on. I guess she's pretty well known now. Zora Murph. I don't know. The list is sort of endless. But come to see the show after Dawoud Bey, which opens April 17th. It's called Underexposed: Women Photographers from the Collection, and I hope there'll be some great discoveries for everybody in there to come see the show. Even people who know photography might see some things that they haven't seen before. So
That's a little photo pun, little photo wink there.
yes, it is. Yeah, underexposed. I mean, the pictures are not underexposed, but actually in some ways they are, because And when we put it together, we actually did some research to see when they were last on view. And for a number of them, they've been in the collection for quite a while. And as far as we can tell, our records go back to 2000. They've never been exhibited. So it's a little bit of, yeah, it's definitely a pun.
Yeah.
A corrective, perhaps.
Yeah. And Nancy Floyd, the Atlanta photographer.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah.
Well, I just want to thank you again for putting this presentation together and for sharing Dawoud Bey's work with us and your work as a curator and letting us know more about the High. There's lots of praise for you in the text, in the comments there, if you want to take a little look. Thank you, everyone, for coming. There will be a recording of this put on our YouTube page for Gwinnett County Public Library. And I hope everyone has a great night.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.